You know. I did. What's that? How is it done?
I didn't forget it.
Oh, I just got a text from all over the place.
I don't do texts. Church doesn't do text.
Yeah, it says, Exodus chapter 6.
Is it a text or a Facebook message?
Facebook message. That's something. I don't know that. I don't know. I didn't know those things like that.
Well, we waited long enough. We're going to go. So, hope everybody's doing okay out there in the virtual World Wide Web that isn't watching right now. So, Exodus chapter 6. Excuse me. We're just going to read the first verse right now, and we'll come back to some more of it later on. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. If we're under compulsion, he will let them go, and under compulsion, he will drive them out of his land." Okay, just a little bit of context. This is actually the conclusion of a paragraph beginning in verse 22 of chapter 5, where Moses is running to God, upset because the Israelites are upset with Moses, and they are experiencing increased hardship from Pharaoh because of Moses seeking to intervene in the relationship between Pharaoh and the Israelites. And Pharaoh's angry, takes it out on the Hebrews and makes them provide their own straw to make their bricks. And so they complain to Moses, and Moses takes it up the chain of command to God and complains to them. And then we come to God's response in here in chapter 6, verse 1. So, any thoughts on what God has to say to Moses here? I thought Mark might want to use the new word he learned this morning. So,
Well, the thought is, God said to Moses, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." Basically, is what he's telling him. And he said, Pharaoh's going to get so angry he's going to drive them out. No, they're not just going to leave. He's going to run them out of town. So,
mm-hmm.
and so basically, this is telling Moses that, hang on, it's going to work.
Okay. And it's going to work really to an extent and in a way that kind of exceeds, I think, our normal memory of these stories. You know, we kind of think of them, and maybe I should just speak for myself, but the memory tends to be of, you know, the wondrous nature of God's liberation, that he opens the doors and Israel leaves. And in a way, that's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, because God has to make them so repugnant to Egypt that Egypt kicks them out. Nobody wants them around. Only one person has any interest in fleeing, in the fleeing nation of Israel, and that is Pharaoh. So he sends his army after him, but everybody else is glad for him to go. And, you know, he used Israel's repugnance to Egypt all along, in a way. You know, he used, when they went down there, because they were shepherds and all that, the Egyptians didn't like them. So they are isolated in the land of Goshen during their time of Egypt, and that helps them become a distinct nation. They don't intermarry with the Egyptians. They don't become a part of the empire. They become a distinct subset within. You can find, it's interesting if you look at the map of South Africa. I think there's two different nations in the South of Africa that are completely surrounded by South Africa. You know, they're within the borders of South Africa are two completely independent nations. And that's kind of what was going on in Egypt with Israel. They were this distinct people. They didn't have political autonomy, but they were isolated, segregated by the cultural preferences of the power that was Egypt. And of course, there's always a negative connotation with segregation in our country, and that's understandable. God can use it, though, and God used it in this context to make Israel go from being a distinct family to being a distinct nation. So they were marrying cousins and stuff like that. They weren't marrying Egyptians. And God is now going to make them even more repugnant to Egypt, so repugnant that they get pushed out. We've already looked at how they're going to plunder Egypt, that the Egyptians are going to actually pay for them to leave. Here's our money. Here's our gold. Get out of here. And it's not just that Egypt has to be made to not want Israel. Israel has to be forced out of this bad situation. And, we talked a little bit last week in our class about people in difficult situations, difficult life circumstances, and how reluctant they are to change, and how even when they do change, a lot of times they return to very negative environments, very negative relationships. And that's not something new, and it's not so weird or unusual. It can be hard for people to understand sometimes, but it's not excessively or it's not so rare. It's all too common. And sometimes the only way people will really make change in life is if they have absolutely no other alternative. You have to have no choice whatsoever. And, that's what's going to happen to Israel. The only way they're going to change is if they can't stay in Egypt anymore. You can't really go back. They don't want you back. And God's going to make that happen. And this is how you overcome the recalcitrance of Israel. They want to go back. They can't go back. So it's quite a plan God has in mind. It's one of those, it's a very typical way in which God's thoughts and plans are so much greater than our own. If we see people in a bad situation or suffering, we try to give them a path out of it. But we basically leave it up to them to do that, don't we? We can't really do anything else. But God says, you're coming out, and that's it. So, anybody else have any thoughts on the conclusion of this conversation between God and Moses? Okay, we'll move on. We'll read verses 2 through 13. God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established a covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned. Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel, because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. So Moses spoke to the sons of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses on account of their despondency and cruel bondage. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the sons of Israel go out of his land. But Moses spoke before the Lord, saying, Behold, the sons of Israel have not listened to me. How then will Pharaoh listen to me? For I am unskilled in speech. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, and gave them a charge to the sons of Israel and to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Okay, what do you think about that? Hi, Robin. She's in here.
First thing is, God reminds Moses who he is. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Basically, just can't think of the words I want to use, but that basically tells Moses that he is a God of his forefathers, and that he would have promised to do certain things, and this is what he's starting to do.
Mm-hmm.
This is the way we get to it.
Mr. Wade?
Basically, the question is, I'm not sure I totally get this in verse 3. But says, put behind my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. Verse 2, I am the Lord. And then in 3 it says, God Almighty. So does that mean up until this point, the time, he was using different name or different address? I'm not sure I quite understand this whole thing.
Well, we'll take a stab at it. One of the ways they date the different texts of the Old Testament is by the term they use for God. And the term God Almighty is normally is the translation of El Shaddai. That is one name. The name, we've already seen it in the original calling of Moses, that Moses says, Who do I say sent me when I get down there? And that's where he uses the tetragram or whatever you want to call it. I think it's got a few more syllables in that term, and I can't really pronounce it. Maybe Mark can do it for us later on. It's the consonants of YWH or YWYH, and the vowels would spell out Yahweh. So that's the name that God gives. This is who you say when you get down, and that is also translated in the other text, I am who I am, or I am who I will be, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. It sounds a little bit like Popeye at the time, I am what I am, but Pharaoh does need to eat his spinach if he's going to deal with God, that's for sure. But it is, that's this name, God is giving Israel, this is like a marriage situation. God is giving Israel his name. Yes, sir.
Well, this comment on that scripture, it says, this does not necessarily mean that the patriarchs were totally ignorant of the name Yahweh, but it indicates that they did not understand its full implications as the name of the one who would redeem his people. Kind of, reinforcing that I am who I am, and that, this is going to work the way I want it to work, kind of,
Well,
like he's going from one level to a new higher.
Right.
In his relationship with people. That's kind of the feeling I have, is that he's telling him even more about himself. Is that?
Well, I mean, we don't have like writings from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so we have stories about them. And so those stories are going to be written by people later on, and they're going to use the language that they use at the time. And Jacob is given the name Israel. The El means God. You have contended with God. or you wrestled with God, or you fought with God. And it's kind of ambiguous as to you're fighting against God in a battle, or you are fighting against humans. You have wrestled with God and man. You're finding your way in the world, through the world with God. It's supposed to be kind of ambiguous. It's not supposed to be one thing or the other. And I think when you look back at the patriarchs and how difficult it is for us in our contemporary value system to look at some of the behaviors that these men and sometimes women exhibited and think of them as great heroes of the faith, I think we can say they are trying to work their own way. The idea of Abraham was the origin of faith. By faith, leave your family and come follow me. But Abraham, when they face problems, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at times take matters into their own hands and try to do it their own way. And, that's still true of God's people today sometimes. And that's, it's not to say that the patriarchs and matriarchs never had that. I mean, you can't absolutely prove anything because we don't have what they said. What we have are what people wrote about them, and the terms they use are the terms they use. And again, that's one way of dating the texts, and it makes it's probably somewhat imprecise. A lot of the dating of all this stuff is very imprecise. So we have to kind of dwell with a little uncertainty about that. And, you can always you can go online and find a precise timeline of how things happen in the Old Testament. And you can find a lot of precision things that precision doesn't always mean accuracy. I mean, they're going to, cut it down to a particular date, but then, and there's some, they're probably not too far off. And they may be right on. So it's as I suggest in the handout, if you got that. And if you're not getting the handout and you want it, let me know. I'll get it to you. But it's does not get proofread. It gets typed up and shipped out. So there's a lot of typos. I saw like 3 or 4 this morning just looking at a couple of sentences in it. So if you get offended by typos, it's not for you. But Sunday morning in my sermon, I talked about the defining challenge of the church, especially as Paul saw it, was in the first century, was blending Jewish and Gentile cultures. The defining moment of Israel's history to the readers of what we call the Old Testament in its original setting would have been the Babylonian captivity, actually. That's how they would have understood all of this. And it's likely that while they were in captivity for 70 years or whatever it was, that the priests, wanting to keep the spirits of the people up while they're in Babylonian captivity, wanting to give them hope for returning to Israel, and a motivation that it can happen and that it will be worth doing, was to take these texts sometimes and kind of rework them with the idea that this is what we're pointing towards. And that's an uncomfortable notion to some extent, but if they were inspired by God to do it, who's to say they weren't? And this is really a second call. This is almost like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The creation story and then the Garden of Eden story, like 2 separate creation stories almost. This is a second calling. And it's kind of, in a way, it goes over very familiar territory. Sometimes it's summarily. God doesn't really explain his name, doesn't talk about it and all that, because that's already there. But ultimately, this and the genealogy we'll look at here in a little bit points to and attempts to legitimize and empower the priesthood, because the priesthood has to be they're the ones taking care of the spiritual needs and providing whatever hope Israel has during Babylonian captivity. They have no political power anymore. There's no judges, there's no kings. They're once again dwelling in a very unfavorable circumstance under the authority of Gentiles. So the priests are saying, listen to us, and here's a path forward. And that path forward is back to a great place, another return to the land flowing with milk and honey. And it can happen if you obey God's commandments. And how do they know what God's commandments are? Israel's had this moral decline. Judah has had this moral decline. So they slump into captivity on a moral level. They're only going to know what they need to do if the priests tell them what they need to do. And why would you listen to the priests? So this is kind of the context, the historical context that you can look at a lot of the Old Testament, if not all of it. This is the target audience, is not so much the people coming up out of Egypt. It's the people you're trying to get out of Babylon. And if you have problems, and if you're recalcitrant while you're in Babylonian captivity, well, guess what? Your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma and grandpa were recalcitrant too back in Egypt. And God brought them up. And you look around and you see this current Pharaoh, the guy named Nebuchadnezzar, and he looks really powerful, like there's nothing you can do about him at all. Well, there was another Pharaoh back in the day. So these stories really matter. They mattered to those people, and I think they matter to us very much today. This is still, they're very human, and the stories of how humans respond and react to difficulty, to leadership, to God's vision and plan for them. You know, in a sense, it doesn't really change. You either accept it or you don't. And it's not easy. It's not easy to walk by faith. The easiest thing in the world is to walk by the flesh. To make your own way, to do the right, what you think is the prudent course of action. And sometimes you're right. If you topped off your gas tanks last week, that was a good move. I did not make that move. But that was a good move. That was wise. You were wise in your own ways of doing that. I'm looking at my truck right now, and I'm about to go put over 20 gallons of gas in. So it's, ouch. I needed someone to direct my steps, drive to the gas station, last week. So, it's not like human wisdom is complete and utter foolishness. It's that it does not lead us to the intentions of God all the time. And just like if you had filled up last week and peace had broken out and the price of gas plummeted, you'd be kicking yourself saying, why did I spend $3.75 a gallon? I could have waited and got it for $3.50 this week. Now $3.75 sounds pretty good. So it's a human wisdom. It's not like it's total foolishness. It's just compared to God, it does not achieve God's purposes. And God has greater, of course, infinitely greater vision and his own plan, and is irresistible in making it happen. It will happen. When Jesus prays to God, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, it will happen. And you may look around at the world right now and say, there is no way that God's will ever be done on earth again. I can't tell you how he's going to bring it about, but I have every confidence that it will be done on earth as it is in heaven, because Jesus asked for it. And if Jesus asked for it, he's going to get it. And he'll get it in a surprising way, probably some way we never would have thought in a million years it would happen. Just as God's plan to get Israel out is a surprising one. It's mysterious. We try to rip all the mystery out sometimes, and we can't really do that. But it shows, again, that, God is going to use Moses. Moses repeats the slow of speech thing again. But again, he's already supposed to have Aaron with him, and Aaron is going to go with him. And that kind of brings us to a portion of scriptures we generally like to practice the Passover on, and that is a genealogy. I guess we got enough time off. I like it when everybody gets to take a turn reading the genealogy, and we all get to laugh at each other. This way you just get to laugh at me, because we can't, we'd have to have a microphone and pass it around or something if we were going to do that for our online friends. So I will stumble through it. Try not to laugh too hard. Verses 14 through 27. These are the heads of their fathers' households. The sons of Reuben, Israel's firstborn, Anak and Palu, Hezron, and I'm having a hard time reading today. Carmi. Those are the families of Reuben. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel and Jamin and Ohad and Jachin and Zohar and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. These are the families of Simeon. These are the names of the sons of Levi, according to their generations: Gershon and Kohath and Merari. And the length of Levi's life was 137 years. The sons of Gershon, Libni and Shimei, according to their families. The sons of Kohath, Amram and Izhar and Hebron and Uzziel. And the length of Kohath's life was 133 years. The sons of Merari, Mali and Mushi. These are the families of the Levites, according to their generations. Amram married his father's sister, Jochebed, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. And the length of Amram's life was 137 years. The sons of Izhar, Korah, and Nepheg, and Zikri. The sons of Uzziel, Mishael, and Elzaphan, and Sithri. Aaron married Elisheba, the daughter of Aminadab, and the sister of Nashon, and she bore him Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. The sons of Korah, Asir and Elkanah and Abiasaph. These are the families of Korahites. Aaron's son Eleazar married one of the daughters of Putiel, and she bore him Phinehas. These are the heads of the fathers' households of the Levites according to their families. It was the same Aaron and Moses in whom the Lord said, "Bring out the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt according to their hosts." These were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing the sons of Israel out from Egypt. It was the same Moses and Aaron. So we can see in this genealogy, as poorly pronounced as those names were, an emphasis really on Levi, can't we? You start out with Reuben and Simeon, but then it goes to Levi and it stops. There's no more of the tribes mentioned. And that's the tribe that's developed. That's the genealogy where they trace it on down. And ultimately the point is Moses and Aaron are of the tribe of Levi. It is the priestly tribe that leads Israel out of Egypt. It wasn't the kingly tribe. It wasn't from the tribe of David, the tribe really, not David so much, but the tribe of Judah that led you out of Egyptian captivity. It was the priestly tribe that got Israel out of, yes, God working through them, but Israel never really, in the biblical context, never completely abandons its tribal identities. Even in the New Testament, they're of this tribe or they're of that tribe. Saul of Tarsus is of the tribe of Benjamin. Jesus is of the tribe of Judah. So it still mattered later on down the road. I don't think they do that now. I think it's more ethnicities like Ashkenazi and some of the other ones. I can't recall right now. But
that's an interesting point that you bring up, and one that it was the tribe of the priests, not the tribe of the warriors that got him out of there. It was because if it would have been the warriors or the tribe of the warriors that let him out of there, they could look at us and see what we did, kind of a thing. But here, it's the religious, the leaders that let him out. This was God's doing that let him out of there.
yes, and a couple of thoughts on that is it's a very passive emancipation. I mean, yes, they have to participate in the Passover, but they're not, like you said, they're not going out. It's not guerrilla warfare. It's not, we're chipping away. They're still trying to keep Pharaoh more or less happy while they're being emancipated. In the Passover, yes, they had to actually do something, but that doesn't change the at its nature, at its core, it's a passive religious expression. It's not actually the shedding of the blood that saves them. It's the angel of death sent from God seeing the blood and passing over. And I think that translates somewhat to our view on baptism. Yes, you actually have to do something, but it is not that you got up and walked down in front of a bunch of people, and that's not what saves you. It's that God sees you. You appeal to God for a clean conscience, and He grants that. So it's still a very passive action. It's still something passive. You receive baptism. You receive communion. You practice it, but you really receive it, and you receive the benefits of it. God sees it and acts. Just as when they're coming down to Egypt, Zipporah circumcises the son, and God sees that and relents from his intent to kill Moses. So God is always the one really in control. Historically, and it's a long ways off, but when you get into the monarchy, the era of the monarchy in Israel, it's almost like it's one or the other. They either have a good king or a good priest. They almost never have both. But when this is after David, but when they have a good priest, they almost never follow him. He doesn't really. He's a lone reed, shaken by the wind. And he's out there, his lone voice, crying out in the wilderness. When they have a good king, they follow the king. And when they have a bad king, they follow the bad king, pretty much. So the priesthood, once they get into Babylonian captivity, there's no king anymore. The priesthood really have to assert their authority. They really have to become the leaders of the people because there's no other leadership. They have no political power. So it's sad sometimes when you read those stories and you'll read about a faithful high priest serving with an evil king and just wasting his time almost, really, but not really, but kind of there's not much he can do. This we call this priesthood sometimes the Levitical priesthood because it descended from the tribe of Levi. It's also called at times the Aaronic priesthood, Aaron's priesthood. And Aaron is a mixed bag. We'll see that down the road. He's not perfect. Moses isn't perfect. And that's God is bringing about this great thing with imperfect people. But we've talked about the patriarchs a little bit, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They weren't perfect. The imperfections of these heroes of the faith are the most hopeful aspects of the story, in my opinion. If they were all perfect, where do we fit in? You know, if Israel was super gung ho and excited, oh yeah, we're going to go fight Egypt. How do we identify with that? If they didn't have their own fears and their own concerns and their own reluctance, their own recalcitrance, you know, where would we fit in as reluctant and fearful and recalcitrant as we are? The humanity of these stories is, I think, it's so inspiring to us. Yes, God has power, and we find comfort in that God can triumph over all of that stuff. But knowing that he can use very broken and flawed people to accomplish his will, that is what's, I think, the most hopeful part of the story.
Well, it's like Paul, you know, even though I want to do this, I do this instead. And so, you know, we can relate to that kind of a person, whereas if you know, just never had any foibles, never had any problems, you can't relate to that. But here is even this great apostle Paul, who says, I struggle with this all the time. I beat myself daily to try and make sure that I do what I need to be doing. Another thing, I like the way you brought that out, that throughout time, there are things that the people have to do in order to receive what God gives them. And that's, you know, in today's, people don't want to acknowledge that there is something that you have to do, just like everybody else did throughout the Bible. There is something that you have to do to receive what God is giving you. It's a gift of salvation, but there are things that you have to do. No, we're not going to be saved by our works, but without your works, you're not going to be saved either. And so, you know, there are things that we have to do, and it's like you showed, it's throughout the Bible.
It's you know, divine appearance requires human response, and Israel has to respond. So, you know, everything God does makes that emancipation the only path forward, really. It's the only thing they can do. I guess you can always just sit there on your rear end in the middle of the sand and not go. I mean, you can do it. Sit there and cook. Wait till, you know, Sidewinder comes up and bites you on the toe when you die. That's a possibility. But to have any chance of life, and that's, you know, when you're dealing with people that need to make change, make real change in their life, usually you have to, at the very least, make the change behavior easier than continuing in the current behavior. And maybe you have to make the change behavior the only way they can do anything. And God, that's what God's doing. Israel has to make a big change. They have to go from being the slaves of Egypt to being God's chosen people, the nation of Israel. And it's going to involve a baptism, isn't it?
Just to carry on that theme a little bit more, you know, to people it may seem silly, you know, I don't want to put blood on my door. That's icky. I don't want to do that. The guy didn't want to go dip in the river. You know, that's a filthy river. I don't want to go doing that. But that's what, you know, however, what is it? The foolishness of man, the wisdom of God is foolish of man, or however that goes. It doesn't have to make sense to us. It's what God said, so do it.
Well, and that's some of the challenges we deal with certain elements of the international political and religious scene. Our response tends to be a pretty logical one. God wouldn't want you to do this. They're not acting logically, and God doesn't have to be logical. And I'm not saying that means God is sanctioning what they're doing, but it does mean we're trying to out-argue them logically when that's not where they're coming from. And so a pretty prominent religious leader pointed that out many years ago, and was really taken to task for it. But one of the most sane thoughts I'd read on the subject. Yeah, it's not about human logic, it's about human wisdom. It's not that it actually accomplishes the purpose. It's that God sees it and responds to our response, our obedience. And that the effectiveness is always because God makes it work, not because of what we do. Let's close this chapter up real quick. And
I'll give you one more comment.
Yes, ma'am.
That brings us back to Moses and God saying that, hey, all along you've known I'm God, but just hang on to your hats. You're going to find out really how much power I have and what I can do, whether you like it or not.
Well, it is a time of wavering faith. When his people are struggling to believe, we talked about this with Abraham, when he says, why don't you just make my slave my heir? Why don't you, I'm giving up on Isaac ever being born. God doesn't keep arguing with him. At some point he says, go out and look at the stars. Who put them up there? And that's how many, you're going to have more descendants than that. So at some point we have to abandon our intellect. And this is not a pursuit of intelligence. This is a pursuit of faith. And trust God, and know that all these stories kind of point to the fact that the circumstances as they appear to human beings can be impossible, but nothing is impossible to God. And God uses the impossibility to magnify his greatness. 28 through 29. And this doesn't actually, we'll be into this a little bit next week in chapter 7, but 28 through 30. And now it came about on the day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, that the Lord spoke to Moses saying, I am the Lord, speak to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I speak to you. But Moses said before the Lord, behold, I am unskilled in speech. How then will Pharaoh listen to me? So this second calling is once again somewhat redundant, because Moses is raising the objection that he kind of fell back on with God. But it is, somewhat shows that maybe an abiding insecurity in Moses. But if it wasn't going to stop God before, it isn't going to stop God now. So we're going to see how God reassures Moses starting next week. So thank you for your attention and your comments here and online. Mr. White, will you lead us in a closing prayer, please, sir?